Welcome to this course on Paul's letter to the Colossians. I'm Robert Lackey, and I'm excited to be the tour guide through this mighty little letter written by the Apostle Paul. Today's session might be a little longer than the others and may seem full of a lot of facts and details, but I want to give you the essentials for the tour ahead. Have you ever thought about what book of the Bible you'd want to have on a desert island if you could only have one? Well, hands down for me, Colossians is the desert island book, or rather letter, to have. It's got all the essential nutrients that Christ followers need. I think Paul planned it that way because he had not yet been to the city of Colossae when he wrote it, and he was in prison at the time of the writing, so likely did not know if he'd ever have a chance to come. We have to remember, too, that in the first century, writing and sending letters was very expensive. So a writer like Paul, who was in ministry and had to be mindful of cost, would make every word count. So I will try to do the same and make our time together in these sessions as worthwhile and as valuable as possible for you. Most of us have seen those little green signs on interstates that tell us when an exit is coming up. Some of those signs just have the name of the towns and maybe that route number that we're about to approach. But sometimes when you're approaching an intersection with one or more other interstates, those green signs have a lot of curvy arrows that tell you which way to turn, to stay on your current course, or how to hop onto another route. I'd like to have you think of this course as offering those kinds of road signs to get you through the letter to the Colossians. That means I won't be usually suggesting to you what each verse and sentence means, but I hope to give you some helpful directions for what to watch for, what assumptions to avoid, and how to dig into the riches that this little book has all on your own. I will do that by asking a lot of questions, and whether you're watching with others or by yourself, I hope that these will encourage you to want to probe deeper. Actually, by teaching through questions, we are learning much the way Hebrew rabbis would have taught their students. So we can pretend we are back in school with the Rabbi Saul, who later became the Apostle Paul. Today we're going to cover some basics for the journey and some things to observe in chapter 1. By the way, the whole letter only has 4 chapters, and much of the latter half of chapter 4 is actually Paul sending greetings to people, so we won't need to spend too much time there. But don't ignore that section either. It reveals much about the heart of Paul and that he was so concerned with the individuals at Colossae and those that were ministering to them. So let's get started with some big picture stuff, some background on the letter. Here's what I want you to imagine are on those big green road signs. First, Paul is writing to the church in Colossae from prison. We are not totally sure what prison stay of Paul's this is. He could be in Ephesus, about 120 miles away, or in Rome, or maybe in Jerusalem. But most scholars tend to lean toward either Ephesus or Rome. But the fact is we can't be sure. But you'll see references to prison here and there throughout the letter. Remember that he is in prison specifically for testifying to Jesus, this new king that many see as a threat to the new Roman emperor. And he has the scars to prove his loyalty to this new king. Next, here is a map that gives you the destination of the letter. Colossae was a relatively small city in what was called Asia Minor, or modern-day Turkey. It is a city along the Lycus River Valley, a valley and trade route that extended directly east from the coast of Asia Minor, and the valley had other big cities in there too with Christians in them, cities you may have heard of like Laodicea and Hierapolis. Colossae was actually destroyed by an earthquake about 10 years after this letter and rebuilt later. Next, the date of the letter is not something we can pin down exactly, but it's likely around 62 AD, so that's only 2 to 4 years before Paul would be executed by order of the Roman Emperor Nero. Next, it's worth noting before we start that Colossae contained a rich mix of people groups settling there, probably because it was a city nearby a trade route. There were ethnic Romans and Greeks, natives of that region who would have called themselves Galatians, and then there were also Jews that settled there. Because many early Christians were slaves in this culture too, they could have come from almost anywhere around the Mediterranean, but ended up in the home of someone in Colossae. You might notice something unusual if you happen to read this letter alongside another of Paul's, his letter to the Ephesians. There are sections of Colossians that mirror very closely, sometimes even word for word, what is in Ephesians. Now, most scholars think that Paul wrote his letters intending them to be circulated to other churches after the letter's original destination had read it. And Ephesians especially seems to be a letter like that. So it's likely Paul wrote Ephesians and Colossians both while in prison, and we don't know which letter came first. But like a lot of us, if Paul had good, important things to say to one church community that applied to others he was writing to around the same time, the letters end up having similar sentences and words. So it's likely that he went ahead and put them in both letters, and that's why these parts could be very similar. But again, there's no reason to be concerned when we see some overlap and repetition of that content. Now, while that might be happening to parts of the letter to the Colossians, much of the content is unique, and there seems to have been some problems specific to this church that Paul wants to address. But we don't have the letters from the Colossians to Paul, so we don't know exactly what the source of those problems was. When we read any of Paul's letters, we have to do something called mirror reading. Ever been in a room where someone is on the phone and you can only hear the voice of the person in the room? We have to piece together the half of the conversation that we hear to try to figure out what the other person on the line is saying, what their issues are, what their tone of voice is and their mood. That's called mirror reading, because we don't know the actual words or ideas of those people, but only as they are reflected back. We will find ourselves having to do that from time to time in Paul's words to the Colossians. So store that idea away for now, but we will be doing some of that mirror reading along the way. Now we're almost ready to look at chapter 1, but just a few more road signs to watch for. It will help you to know what I and others believe to be Paul's overall purpose in this letter. I think it can be best summed up as the superiority of Jesus, the Christ. In other words, Jesus and life in Jesus far exceeds what can be gained from any other God or person, philosophy, or lifestyle. Another way to say this is the superadequacy of Christ. Now, when we hear the word adequate, I know used to describe something, we sometimes think, well, okay, that's adequate, but we're saying it in a humdrum, kind of just barely making the mark kind of way. But Paul is saying that Jesus far exceeds anything and anyone else, every other God or person or philosophy or lifestyle. This is adequate, but it's adequacy on steroids. So as you read, see if you can see that superiority theme coming through. But what will be intriguing is how Paul makes this personal and relevant to them. You may see some other themes coming through again and again, and if so, that's great. We're blessed to all be able to read and interpret Scripture as long as we do it responsibly and humbly, and best of all, together with others. Some other reminders and suggestions for you. One big thing I hope to drive home is that we remember that when Paul is writing this, it's only 30 years or so after the central event of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. So it's really a new thing. Christianity for us, on the other hand, has been around 2,000 years. But for Paul and his readers, they're basking in how new this event is that has changed their lives and turning them upside down. So try to imagine yourself hearing words that had to have sounded bizarre and even revolutionary, turning everything they knew on its head. Second, as we come across religious and theological words and phrases, I want you to slow the car down and look at them carefully and do your best to wrestle with them until we understand what Paul would have meant when he said them. Third, remember that Paul is going to deliver his message with a combination of encouragement, identification, and correction. Now, what do I mean by that? Paul's letter to the church contains words that are meant to encourage them for living for Jesus faithfully and to get them to stay the course. His letter also talks extensively about who they are now that they follow Jesus, as much, if not more, than about what following him requires them to do. This is really important to him that they understand they have a new identity, a new status, a new position due to what Jesus accomplished. It is only after making this identity clear that Paul then gives them directions of what to do in order to live for Jesus, the new King. This just reminds me of something I heard recently, that we're called human beings, not human doings. But we can tend to make Christianity all about stuff we're supposed to do. But the Christian life starts by grounding us first in who we are. Now, the third way Paul communicates, besides encouragement and identification, is with correction. But he does this here in this letter in a way that's gentle and encouraging. We know from some of his other letters that he can get pretty hot and bothered sometimes when he's addressing other churches' problems. But here, when he speaks words of corrections to the Colossians, it is as an old man who knows that the struggle of following Jesus and suffering for him can be hard, but really oh so worth it. So more than anything, he seems to call them back time and time again, though, to recognize who they are and whose they are. So I think we're almost finished with our introduction, but as I said, I wanted to present some road signs to guide us on the road. And just so you know what to expect here at the beginning, the first chapter can be divided up into 3 parts. We'll cover these next time, but I want to go through some of the introduction of this. First of all, verses 1 to 12 are Paul's greeting and prayer to the Colossians. Many of his other letters start this way too, and it's designed to let them know his love and excitement for them, followed by his earnest prayer for this little church. Verses 13 to 23, which follow, contain an amazing passage where he tells them who Jesus is and who they are in Jesus. Now, these are those powerful identification words. You will want to take a notebook and write down in there or on a whiteboard, put up 2 columns. One column that lists who they are now as a result of Jesus coming, and in the second column, and closely intertwined with that, who this Jesus really is. Because inside 13 to 23 and verses 15 to 20 is what seems to be a hymn of worship to and about Jesus. Some actually think Paul lifted these verses out of a very early hymn and planted them here in this letter. Whether that is accurate or not, we can't be sure, but the tone of these verses does take on a rhythmic, musical quality based on its use of repetition of words and phrases. Clearly, it was meant to be memorized. Now, there's a recent song by Andrew Peterson you might want to search for on YouTube or Spotify or whatever your music source is, and it's called All Things Together, where you can hear these words from Colossians about Christ put to a beautiful, simple tune. Check it out. Paul moves out of this hymn after verse 20 and now returns to who they are, a people reconciled to God and presented without blemish and spotless. By the way, Paul wrote all his letters in Greek, and in this section he uses the plural form of the word you, because he's always talking to the whole combined church of Colossae as a community, not as a bunch of individuals. We need to really keep that in mind, that he means not just me when he writes the word you, but us, as this new community that God created by Jesus' death and his resurrection. That's really core for Paul, that our new identity has placed us in a new status and position before God, but we do so with others, some of whom we were not always so friendly with before. But those walls have now been torn down. Now, more on that later. Verses 24 to 29 are what I title God's Mystery Now Revealed. And even though it's the shortest passage of the 3 I gave you, it might be the most challenging to unwrap and get our heads around. Paul will talk about his own suffering, somehow completing or filling up the suffering done by Jesus. That will take some time to explore. But when he moves into this, how the very event of Jesus' death and resurrection, a new mystery or secret has been revealed. That is the revelation or the revealing that those outside the Jewish community, those that have been locked out of all of God's promises given to Israel, are no longer excluded from those promises. By what Jesus accomplished, access to all that God intended for Jews has been open for Gentiles or non-Jews, and all that comes with a new fellowship with God, too. So I invite and urge you now to go back and read the first chapter of Colossians, which we will cover further next time. Read through it slowly, all the way through the first time, but without pausing. I say that because that's likely how the Colossian Christians would have likely experienced it for the first time. But keep in mind the three main subsections that I mentioned here. Verses 1 to 12, which contain Paul's opening and his prayer. Verses 13 to 23, which describe our new identity in the Christ, who is the image of the invisible God. And then verses 24 to 29 introduce us to God's mystery, which has now been revealed. As you work your way through, pretend again that Christianity is new, and maybe even disturbing all of your categories and preconceptions with all that he is saying here. And ask yourself, or have your group ask these questions together, which I will close with. Why has Paul decided to commit his life to this new faith, this new leader, this new king? What are his reasons that we've just seen in this first chapter? See if you can identify at least three. And then, how are we different based on the description of what Paul has said has happened to us as a result of Jesus coming? This question alone might lead to a long list of stuff that you might be writing down, but aim for at least three things that now make us different and change our status with God and with others. We will continue next time to probe into chapter 1 more deeply. But before we go, let me encourage you to be using a Bible that's readable for you. That's really going to help you enjoy this a lot more. It's helpful, too, to have a Bible that's considered a study Bible, because the additional footnotes can really be handy when you're really digging into what the verses mean. But a study Bible isn't essential. Another thing, take time to be grateful that we have these Bibles. We can go back again and again and process what Paul meant to say. The Colossians had to rely on having it read to them and then likely memorizing as much of it as they could. So we're so blessed to have Bibles that we can do this with. And I want to urge you to have your Bibles open while going through this. And feel free to stop playing the video at any time and address the questions I'm asking. Or maybe just so you can check out something I said for yourself. That's how a study like this can be most impactful. So we will see you next time. Watch for those road signs and enjoy the ride.